Good evening. Welcome to Empower You. It's good to see all of you here. It's good to have those of you that are online. Just going to introduce a couple or point out a couple of our board members that are here. Barb Horwitz, you're going to hear from her in a little bit. Karen Cartier, Bill Roll, our treasurer, and Jay Grunke in the back. He's our producer. How many of you, were all of you here for the class the other night? Pretty many of you? Good. You weren't here. Well, you got to watch that. Michael Gonzalez was here talking about CRT again through the Heritage Foundation. He went back to where it kind of started, the roots of it through critical theory. But before him, we had Isaac Adi. He's from Nigeria. And I always love to hear people like him that have come here from another country and gone through immigration the way you're supposed to, and how much they appreciate this country. And I think as Americans sometimes, well, I'm not going to say sometimes, I know we don't appreciate our country the way somebody like that does. Mainly, a lot of it because we haven't lived anywhere else. We don't know how bad it could be. We think it's real bad here, but evidently it could be worse somewhere else. So for anybody other than Jan who wasn't here the other night, I'd encourage you to go on and watch it. I'll tell you something else. I've gone on recently and rewatched a couple of the classes, and I'm kind of surprised that I missed things. I don't know if I forgot them. Sometimes I get distracted in the back. So I've been glad that I've gone back and listened to them because I've learned even more by doing that. Just want to thank those of you that have been giving so generously to supplement what we do here. If you would like to donate to our cause, you can do that when you register online. There's a donate button there. There's a donate button on our website where you can go. And if you're not comfortable doing that, you can always mail a check to our physical address, which you will find on the website, empoweryouamerica.org. And of course, if you're in the studio, we always pass our red buckets around. If you've got $1 or $2 to give, we really appreciate that. Also, I didn't think to ask you, do you want to take classes or questions at the end of your presentation? Okay. So if you have any questions tonight, when he's ready to take questions, please raise your hand and wait for me to bring a microphone to you, because if you're not speaking into a microphone, the people online can't hear you. And if you're online and you have a question, just drop to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A button and type your question in there. I just forgot to bring a schedule up here for me, so hopefully I'm going to remember what we have next week. Next Tuesday, our class is Active Killer. And unfortunately, we've had this class. We tried to have this class a year ago, and of course, we had to close the studio, so we weren't able to do it. So a few weeks ago, they had the shooting in Tennessee in a Kroger store. Yesterday, there was a shooting at a high school. You know, I don't really like to think about it, and I don't like to say it, but how many times do you go out the door to go do your grocery shopping? Do you think, am I going to come out of that store? I don't ever think about that. But Bob's going to be teaching what you need to do if you find yourself in a situation like that. He goes into businesses also and teaches this information. So that's a class I would encourage you to come to. We hope that we'll never be in that situation, but I think everybody in Kroger's a couple of weeks ago didn't think they were going to be in that situation either. So you kind of want to need to know what to do. That class starts at 6:30, a half an hour early. So put that on your schedule if you're coming. And also, all of our classes are put online within 24 hours of the class ending. That class is not going to be online, or it's going to be online that night, but it's not going to be posted to our website. So if you're interested in that topic, you're going to have to be here in the studio, or you're going to have to be online because you won't be able to watch it later. And then next Thursday, I think, is our body snatcher class, the body snatcher's wife. So it won't be quite as serious. It sounds serious, and I guess it was back in the day when it was going on. So it's going to be a little bit of Cincinnati history of when bodies were stolen from graveyards and probably other places, and medical students were given those bodies to learn on. So the gal that's doing that, she dresses in period costume, and she's going to have some instruments with her that they used for, I don't know when they took the body or what they did, but she's going to have some stuff here. So I hope you'll make that the class also. We got a couple more prizes tonight. How about you choosing a ticket for me? Number 48, what is that, 4810? 4810? That's what I was wondering. Is it 4610? Anybody got that? No? These numbers aren't real clear. How about choosing another one? 4625. Ah, well, guess who gets The Dying Citizen by Victor David Hanson? Did you? She saw that when she came in, so she said she put her good karma on that. You know, you have to give a book report on that. Okay. And also, those of you that have been attending our classes, you know we don't stock Coke anymore because they got a little bit too political for us. So we're kind of pushing Pepsi now. So the next winner is going to win a 12-pack of Pepsi or Diet Pepsi. You read it. I didn't do well. 4620. If you say it's it, I trust you. You can come up and take a, that's fine. You can do that later. And the last door prize we have is for our online audience, and it's Woke Inc. by Vivek Ramaswamy. And those of you online don't have to do anything. Name will be selected and we will mail it out to you. Next, we have one of our board members, Barb Horowitz, who's going to talk about, I already forgot your topic, civil disobedience. Thank you. Back when we had our board meeting in January, Dan said he would like for somebody on the board to kind of talk about civil disobedience, and Barb was the only one that had the courage to do it. So we appreciate you doing it, Barb. Barb was a member of the Butler County, Ohio legal community for many years, serving first as a paralegal in 2 general practice firms, then as the bailiff for retired common pleas judge Michael Sage, and finally as an attorney in a firm where she specialized in insurance litigation and consumer bankruptcy. She has continued her practice of insurance law and consumer bankruptcy in a partnership with her son, Jonathan Horowitz, at offices presently in Centerville, Ohio. She resided for many years in Springfield Township, where she served as president of the View Place Civic Association. In addition, she has volunteered in several political campaigns. She and her husband, Gary, have now resided and raised their family in Wyoming for several years. And I understand Gary has been her critique of her talk tonight, and I'm supposed to give him an award, but I haven't figured out what that is yet. Barb, you want to come on up?
Just give a plug before I start. I just finished Woke Inc. This afternoon, and that is really worthwhile. This name just went out of my, Vivek Ramaswamy has got a mind. It just, if you get a chance, read the book. I heard even on the radio, Brian Thomas was saying there's like a waiting list at the library. They have 25 copies of the book, and there was a waiting list 18 people long to read it. But it's a worthwhile read. At any rate, now on to my talk. Who amongst us hasn't considered an act of civil disobedience over these past several months? COVID restrictions on our civil liberties, illegal immigrants carrying COVID, government spending, woke culture, kind of makes you feel like acting out in protest, doesn't it? So what exactly is civil disobedience, and how has it been used in the past to help change society? When people in a society refuse to comply with the law or a government order in an open and public way, without violence, because they believe it is unjust, They are participating in a form of political protest, which we call civil disobedience. It's been employed as a major tactic and philosophy of social movements in many countries. It's based on a belief that there is a higher morality and an ethical authority governing society that rises above the people who make and those who enforce our laws. It further requires that the civilly disobedient person be willing to accept the penalties for breaking a law he considers unjust. It is precisely because acts associated with civil disobedience are considered crimes and known by both the actor and the public at large to be punishable that such acts serve as a protest. It's like sitting at a whites-only lunch counter during the struggle for civil rights. By willingly submitting to punishment, the civil disobedient hopes to set a moral example that will provoke the majority of citizens and the government itself into enacting meaningful political, social, or economic change. In order to set a moral example, the leaders of civil disobedience insist that the illegal actions be nonviolent. While civil disobedience is frequently criticized as being an expression of contempt for law, leaders such as Martin Luther King regarded it as a display of reverence for law, stating that any man who breaks a law the conscience tell him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of the law is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for the law. Tonight, we're going to look at two great American proponents of civil disobedience to see how they implemented it. Henry David Thoreau, who coined the term and philosophized the concept of civil disobedience while putting it into a limited action, and Martin Luther King, who studied Thoreau and used his concepts to create a workable tool that very effectively helped achieve his advancements in changing society during the 1950s and 1960s. Hopefully, through their thoughts and actions, we can be guided in constructive ways to protest the societal ills we're currently experiencing. And Jay, if you want to bring up that first slide. There he is. You may remember Thoreau from your high school days. He's the one who lived for a couple years in a rustic cabin beside Walden Pond, where he reflected and wrote about living a simple, self-sufficient life, unifying as much as possible with nature. He thought deeply about his role in society. At the time he lived, in the first half of the 1800s, he strongly objected to the country's involvement in the Mexican-American War following our annexation of Texas, and was morally opposed to American expansion into the West and South. He was also especially disgusted with slavery. Thoreau was philosophically opposed to organized government, believing that it should interfere as little as possible with the natural rights of men. He saw government agents of all kinds as corruptible and able to be manipulated when making and enforcing laws. While living at Walden, he spent a night in jail. That experience defined his philosophy of his role in life and his social activism. One night, while going about routine errands, he ran into Sam Staples, the local constable and tax collector. Sam pleasantly asked him to pay his taxes, which Thoreau had left unpaid for about 6 years. He declined to pay, and Staples locked him up. The next morning, an unidentified lady who was probably his aunt paid the tax and he was set free. That one night, he then decided, was enough to make his point that he could not monetarily support a government that endorsed slavery and waged an imperial war against Mexico. Since very few people would have actually known about this act of civil disobedience, he put it into an essay, which was at first called Resistance to Civil Government and later changed to Civil Disobedience. The essay actually received its greatest attention in the 20th century, when it found an eager audience with the American Civil Rights Movement. His message is that there's a higher law than the civil one, and the higher law must be followed, even if a penalty ensues. In his own words, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. Civil disobedience called on all Americans to engage in a nonviolent revolution with the aim of overthrowing the government. Thoreau urged all public employees to quit their jobs if asked to do something against their consciences, and all citizens to stop voting and paying taxes. He renounced allegiance to the state and declared that he intended to withdraw and stand aloof from it completely. He argued that, I think we should be men first and subjects afterwards. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice. Jay, are you ready to go to the next? I don't see it. Oh, okay. Here we go. Thank you. Amen. Oop, too far? No. There he goes. Martin Luther King studied Thoreau while a college student. He admired Thoreau's nonviolent methods and his theme of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, although he did not endorse an overthrow of the government. His vision for equality was deeply rooted in the American dream. In the early years of his activism, he did believe in self-defense against possible attackers. It was when he became an admirer and student of Mahatma Gandhi's teachings that he became an advocate of nonviolent resistance as the way to accomplish his goals for civil rights. In his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in 1964, he explained that nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time, the need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence. Man must evolve for all human conflict, a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. King took Thoreau's concept then and moved them a practical step forward by organizing nonviolent protest into meaningful actions to arouse public support. He strategically used methods and places in which protests were carried out to his advantage. He chose to make his stands in situations where he could control the circumstances to a large extent, rather than just joining into ongoing demonstrations. He organized and led marches to highlight the abuses of Southern segregation laws against Blacks' right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other civil rights. He used sit-ins, protests, and boycotts to advance his cause. He realized that these acts would lead to extensive media coverage of the struggle for Black equality and voting rights. Journalistic accounts and televised footage of the daily deprivation and indignities suffered by Southern Blacks and the exposure of segregationist violence and harassment of civil rights workers and marches resulted in a wave of public opinion sympathetic to the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. The contrast between the nonviolent protesters and the segregation authorities, who many times turned violent on camera, struck home and eventually led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. His campaigns against racial segregation and economic injustice, although nonviolent, were intentionally confrontational. His followers occupied public spaces with their marches and sit-ins, which openly violated laws. King's intent was to provoke mass arrests, which would then create a crisis situation that would inevitably open the door to negotiation on laws that were racially unjust. He achieved that in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. His Southern Christian Leadership Conference recruited children and young adults to join in the demonstrations. During the protests, the Birmingham Police Department, led by Eugene Bull Connor, used high-pressure water jets. Did that change? No, it didn't. Yep. High-pressure water jets and police dogs against the protesters, including the children. Footage of the police brutality was broadcast on national television and dominated the nation's attention, outraging many white Americans and consolidating Black Americans behind the movement. King was arrested and incarcerated. From his cell, he composed his letter from Birmingham jail, which has been described as one of the most important historical documents penned by a modern political prisoner. In it, he stated that we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Looking at this in today's world, with the societal pressures of the moment, who exactly is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? The King said that all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. According to critical race theory, white people are inherently and irretrievably the oppressors, without exception, based entirely on the color of their skin. And their children must be trained through the school curriculums to accept this unquestionably. Certainly, wrongs were done in the past. And certainly, our society has struggled for years with how to correct those wrongs. But doesn't this classification of all white people fly in the face of what Dr. King taught about distorting the soul of all Americans? The demonstrations by the Stop Critical Race Theory group against its implementation in various boards of education is a positive application of civil disobedience. Again, according to King, such acts are not wrong. He said, if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. And if we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer that never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie, love has no meaning. And we are determined to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Both King and Thoreau came to believe that the greatest obstacle to social progress are those moderate citizens who are more devoted to keeping order rather than promoting justice, and who do nothing in the face of tyranny by those in power. Do we accept critical race theory influences in our government and in our schools in order to keep the peace? Do we accept the trends toward Marxism in our country to preserve the peace? Do we go along with all the restrictions placed upon our freedoms based on the pandemic? And will these restrictions end, or will they go on and on while continuing new strains of COVID are anticipated endlessly into the future? Or do we take some constructive action now to stand against these injustices, despite the risks we'll make to our own personal comfort now in order to preserve our basic freedoms for the future? A quote from Martin Luther King rings true when he said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, his prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others. If Martin Luther King was alive now, what would he be doing? And what would he be thinking? Thank you. Thank you. Oops.
That was really good. I can tell you put a lot of time into that. I think the DOJ doesn't really consider the parents going to the school boards as being civil disobedience, do they? Let's hope they finally wake up.
Yeah.
Our main speaker tonight, preparing for the digital dollar, Michael Hiles. He's a business executive focused on early stage technology research and development. As a software engineer, he is a technology solutions architect with marketing, business operations, and financial experience. Michael began developing software on mainframe systems at an early age in the late 1970s. He began his career in the early 1990s as a software engineer for Sabre Systems and Services, which later became Manatron, a provider of local county government enterprise solutions. In 1995, Michael founded SoftLink Interactive, one of the first web development companies in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. After exiting his web development firm in 2000, Michael sought to bring web technology to other industries. He began the lead internet and architect for ProWare, a Cincinnati-based GovTech software provider. ProWare builds judicial management solutions, and Michael's team won a Smithsonian Laureate Award for being the first to ever connect a judicial system to the World Wide Web, courtclerk.org. Michael served as president of the board of directors for the Franklin County Economic Development Commission in Franklin County, Indiana in 2012. While acting as board president, Michael's efforts led to the creation of a local business development TIF district and relocation of a large manufacturing plant, UniRef, into a vacant facility, creating many career wage jobs. He launched the Cincinnati chapter of Founder Institute, the local operation for the Silicon Valley-based global accelerator founded by Adeo Resi. In 3 years, the local accelerator launched almost 30 companies with pre-money valuations of 1 million each. Early in 2017, Michael formalized the founding team and launched 10XTS, a provider of blockchain information governance, risk, and compliance information and data solutions. Please welcome Michael Hiles.
Thank you. Thank you. Testing, testing, check. There I am. There I am. Hi, everybody. We're here to talk about some fun technology stuff tonight, and I've made it my entire career passion to try to make it simple for the average person. However, we're going to talk about some complicated topics, so I'll take questions at the end and hopefully try to answer them all for you. So the topic tonight is, are you ready for the digital dollar? How many here have heard of anything relating to the digital dollar that's coming? Oh, I got a well-informed crowd tonight. This is great. So as Betty had read my bio, I'm Michael Hiles. I'm the CEO of 10XTS, 10XTS is my software company. I'm also a general partner in a cryptocurrency investment fund called Cincinnati Crypto Fund. And so we make investments in cryptocurrencies and the emerging market of blockchain. So I want to talk real quick, since this is a Cincinnati group and I'm in my hometown, I speak all over the place, but because we're in Cincinnati, most people don't understand just how rich of a legacy Cincinnati has for some major firsts in high technology. How many here know of Cencom Systems, right? Our office is like literally around the corner in Glendale. They used to have the building on Montana Avenue off 74. Tom Neese started Cencom in 1967, and my dad worked for Cencom through the 70s into the 80s. And as I was a little kid, when Betty was reading my bio, that's actually where I was first exposed to computing, and I was like 8, 9 years old. So then, of course, I wasn't involved with Fifth Third and Genie, but most people may or may not know that ATM machines were invented in Cincinnati, Ohio. Genie Network was the very first ATM network to be deployed, and we invented it right here at home. The other cool thing, how many here remember the Cincinnati Stock Exchange? Gentlemen here, a couple gentlemen. Cincinnati Stock Exchange was the very first stock exchange to pioneer electronic trading. It was invented right here at home. And then of course, NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange, that's all we do now, right? There's nobody on the trade floor. It's all a bunch of computers. So, and then we mentioned ProWare. ProWare's got some cool firsts, right? The first to connect Hamilton County Clerk of Courts to the browser so that you could do a case search. Nobody had ever done that before in the early days of the internet. Now every county has a web portal that you can go to and do a case search, courtclerk.org. They had an old mainframe system and needed to get with the times. So we connected to the internet, and then here comes the Smithsonian Institute and gave us a laureate award. And then several years later, I was the first to deploy a biometric device to sign a judge's document on the bench with a thumbprint into official public record. Happened right here in Hamilton County, Ohio. So we got some other cool, more recent stuff, right? Loop was a company that was founded by Adam Kaler and a crew, Austin Allison, several years ago. They were the first to automate the end-to-end process of a real estate transaction, all of the closing through the internet, through the cloud. They were acquired by Zillow for, I don't know, lots of money. And then we hope to continue that tradition with SynXDS. We got some firsts that we're doing there. When working in the blockchain space, we're the first blockchain native records management governance risk compliance platform, which is really boring, nerdy library sciences type stuff. I'm a hit at parties, you know, talking about records management and compliance and workflows and all that stuff. So the objectives for this session tonight, we want to review a bit of the basic technology so that you at least can understand what some of this buzzword bingo is that you hear bannered around with a lot of these terms. And then discuss how the technology is actually impacting capital markets, money, banking, and ultimately regulatory and policy at the federal and the state levels. So how many here have heard of Bitcoin? Everybody. When I started talking about Bitcoin, nobody had heard of it, right? Like 2014, 2015, nobody knew what this stuff was. In 2008, an anonymous person named Satoshi Nakamoto was a participant in an anonymous discussion forum dealing with cryptography and programming, and announced that he'd released a white paper defining a system for digital cash that was a highly secured, immutable system for money to operate across computer networks. And then the next year, some programmers got together and liked the idea, thought it was a great idea in the white paper, and launched the actual first Bitcoin network start and launched servers and got the network up and running. And of course, it's huge today, right? So the technology that underpins Bitcoin is called blockchain. And it's a complicated term, but there's basically 5 key components to blockchain. You have cryptography, which is what we software guys like to do with encrypting data and running mathematical algorithms to obfuscate and scramble passwords and data and documents. And then you have a peer-to-peer electronic network, a computing network. A peer-to-peer means that when I want to transmit data to somebody, I'm sending it directly to them. I'm not sending it through, like, for example, my ISP for my internet service. I'm sending it straight to that server. Then you have a consensus mechanism. A consensus mechanism is a mathematical model that is processed by the computers so that they agree on the data on the network. And it's mathematically provable by running these complex algorithms. Then you have a ledger. And when I say ledger, I mean it's a traditional ledger. It is what you would think of as an Excel spreadsheet. There's transactions involving party A, party B, what was the denomination of the transaction. And then you have validity rules, where then once the transaction occurs, how does the network go back and double check and verify that? So back in the early days, let's talk about the network. When it was launched, you had hobbyists that were plugging in together lots of computer processors in their basements and just playing with the technology. It was very much a hobbyist effort at the time. And now we have entire industry of just massive data centers that are operating these blockchain cryptocurrency networks, not just Bitcoin, but many others. So what is this data, right? The data is, when you say blockchain, it literally means there are blocks of data that's highly encrypted that includes a block identity, a number, a block number, right? And then it has some cryptographic hash information that's all encrypted that does some cool things like include the number of the previous blocks. So then you're now chaining these blocks together with complicated cryptography that's all mathematically validated to have a true, immutable single source of truth that is then distributed and shared by all of the people operating computers on that network. What's in those blocks? Transactions, right? You can see in each block, there's a transaction that also has a cryptographic piece of information associated with it. Well, what are those transactions? Well, we're going to learn about Bitcoin tonight. Alice and Bob. So Alice has a Bitcoin. She logs into her Bitcoin wallet. If you remember, one of the essential components of blockchain was a wallet. And then Alice uses her private key, which is essentially a very complex password, and uses Bob's public key, which is like his web address, for example, his email address, just in a different form on the network. And she sends Bob a Bitcoin and transmits that. What happens is that transaction is broadcast to the whole Bitcoin network. And then some series of checks happen. For example, does Alice actually have the Bitcoin in her wallet on the network to send to Bob? So what happens is then the miner or the servers, the people operating those nodes, pick up that transaction and seeks to do all of that validation, and then assembles many of these transactions into what becomes a block, and then transmits that block to that network. And then the other miners or the other servers on the network mathematically will validate whether or not those transactions are actually true and provable with the math and the algorithm that's involved. And then once that's actually submitted and connected to the previous block, the chain is rebroadcast to the entire network, and the servers again do a double check to validate that, yep, all of these transactions are good, everything is good. And in that instance, the block is written to the database, written to the ledger. And then once that completes, the guy running the server, the node, the miner, gets paid a reward called mining Bitcoin. Gets paid because when Alice sends Bob the Bitcoin, she also pays a really tiny incremental little transaction fee, usually called gas in the business. And you pay gas to reward and incentivize the miners to then pick up your transactions and do their thing and then complete and finalize the transaction. So now there are many what we call tokens, blockchain, like Bitcoin, right? There are many variations, thousands of them. This has spawned an entire industry. It's not just Bitcoin. It's many networks with many different use cases. And you can go on various trading venues, Coinbase, Binance. These are online sites that operate much like your trade account, Fidelity, TD Schwab, but instead of buying and selling and speculating on the value of shares of AAPL, for example, you're actually buying and trading in these digital forms of currency, Bitcoin or Ethereum or Litecoin. And there's a lot of speculation in the space. There's a lot of investment activities, and that's where the regulators started to lean in. Are these things securities? Are they commodities? What are these? They're new and novel forms of a digital asset that has never occurred before. So it's left a lot of confusion in the traditional markets and traditional banking and traditional securities law. And the United States is working feverishly to try to sort this out. Every jurisdiction, every government is trying to figure this stuff out. The shift is tantamount to the invention of the internet, because what it's doing is it's completely changing how banking, capital markets, finance, payments operate in literally on a global scale. But there's a big problem, because the original white paper says Bitcoin's a form of electronic cash. Well, when you have speculators buying and selling and trading these things every day, all day long, the volatility of the price goes up and down. And there was an example back in 2010. It's called Pizza Day in the industry. And that's when a programmer put out on a bulletin board on the computer, I'm really hungry, I'll pay somebody 10,000 Bitcoins for a Domino's pizza. Somebody took him up on the offer, ordered him a Domino's pizza. He sent 10,000 Bitcoins, which today, based on the 55,000, 50,000 approximate price per Bitcoin, is roughly $500 million. So as the value has grown, the volatility, the problem is if I buy a loaf of bread with my Bitcoin, the price of that Bitcoin may fluctuate such that now I'm paying $30 for a loaf of bread, or go the other direction. And now the merchant loses money because they're getting Bitcoin that was worth at the time of the transaction the price of the product or goods that were sold, but then the fluctuation of the currency dropped. So the innovation in the industry, you got a lot of smart people, a lot of smart minds that are always working on trying to solve these problems. And the industry came up with a solution called stable coins. How many here have heard of stable coins? Kevin, that's not fair. You've heard of stable coins. Stable coins are essentially using the Bitcoin type of technology, but applying it to real world assets. Mainly, if you look at the column on the left, these are all private sector solutions where there is a Bitcoin type of token that's created for a dedicated US Treasury dollar in a trust account at an institution, a licensed trust or a bank. There's this emergent form of custody that's taking place. Somebody got the bright idea and said, well, to flatten out the volatility of these tokens, why don't we just peg the token to $1 in a treasury account? And everybody said, cool. Now there's some other stable coins where people are working on pegging these tokens to gold, many commodities assets. And what's happening is you're seeing fractionalization take place. So I can own one token that represents this teeny tiny little fraction of a bar of gold in a vault somewhere, right? And then there's some other crypto-backed ones that are really, really complicated that they're not working out very well. And I don't think they'll pass regulatory muster, so we won't cover them. So now there's a big radical difference between, once again, the peer-to-peer transaction of the token model, where I can send Kevin a Bitcoin directly, and it doesn't require any other intervention. Whereas today we're used to banking and financial transactions that are an account model. And I have an institution that holds that account and has my money, and all of the payment and the settlement and the counterparty risk, everything is handled by that institution. So this is a radical shift because we're basically taking these intermediaries out of financial equations and really mixing it up for the banks, and everybody's scrambling to try to figure these things out. So one of the things that you can do with stable coins, people say, well, oh my gosh, you've got this digital form of currency. Well, if it's a bank, I might still have an account at the bank where I have to go through know your customer and AML to validate who I am, to open an account and have a transaction. And then I might get a stable coin, but then I might use that stable coin on a blockchain network to pay for a pizza somewhere, right? And then that person may use that same stable coin. So there is a level of similarity to the way cash currently works today. You got the coffee can retirement fund under the bed, and you go peel some bucks out of it and, go down to the bar or whatever, and you use the money. It never hits the bank records, right? It's all literally what cash was designed to be, an anonymous settlement for a private party transaction. Only when somebody wants to convert from the digital form back to the traditional treasury currency form, then would they actually have a currency in an account at an institution to do that trade in. Well, that anonymity factor, because of the digital side of it, presents somewhat of a challenge for the regulatory folks, because they're all concerned about, well, what if drug dealers use these things to buy drugs on Silk Road and these underground dark networks? Well, last time I checked, good old-fashioned Benjamin Franklin was hoarded by the drug cartels to the level of like stuffing them in garbage bags and being used for underground transactions. So the logic kind of doesn't necessarily hold water. So let's talk about the benefits of these things. We talked about the volatility, right? You're talking about something that now doesn't have the fluctuation of that speculative market of trading these digital assets. And I'm talking at this point, the cumulative combined value of all of the cryptocurrency space is over $2 trillion. So we're not talking about a small amount of money. This thing in the past decade has blown up to be a macroeconomic consideration on a global scale. And then you've got money that moves with a lot less friction from a bank standpoint. I have to go to the bank when they're open, right? The bank closes at the end of the day. So if I don't get my transaction in before 2 p.m. when they do the, the sweeps in the afternoon, it posts the next day. None of those kinds of issues exist with a digital form of settlement transaction currency. The cool part is money can literally be programmed like software. We can program rules and constraints. And actually in the legal profession, there's a merger between making contracts that traditionally work on paper now are digital, and these financial contracts will automatically settle when the conditions are met, and it doesn't require anyone to settle on the back end and process the transaction. So the other thing about blockchains is because it's an immutable record, can't be changed, right? It's out there permanently. It's great. It can be tracked for, all kinds of, retroactive purposes for tax filings and law enforcement. Like if they do need to track a fraud case, all of that transactional record is out there on the network. And ultimately with a stable coin, if need be, it can be programmed in such a way that if there's fraud or theft, the money can literally be, recaptured and pulled back out of the account. Unlike a Bitcoin, when you send a Bitcoin, it's gone, right? Its possession is literally ownership, which is problematic in the legal sphere. But because we've now added the technology to these real world assets that still intersect with banks, you're starting to see a merger and a compromise in the industry that they're coming together. They're leveraging these things. So now stable coins have grown on their own, independent of Bitcoin and these other cryptocurrencies. And you now have central bank digital currencies where the central banks themselves are saying, gosh, we need this kind of technology. We need to digitize the actual treasury dollar itself. And there are pilot projects that are going on all over the world right now. And if you look and see the nation that's coded in green versus our nation, which is gray, because we're still talking about it, we're behind. There is a global currency war that is happening and taking place right now under the hood to battle for the future of global reserve currency status. We're losing that war. We are behind. China has piloted their digital yuan in multiple cities and now have entered into multiple relationships with central banks to pilot cross-border transaction settlement with a digital renminbi. We're still talking about it. Excuse me. But it's enough to get these guys out of bed now, right? So now the Federal Reserve, Bank of International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, they're all leaning in. Who's going to regulate this? How's this stuff going to work? How do we control this? How do we ensure that, this is going to be legal and compliant? And in some instances, probably, do we want the competition? Private market kind of solved a problem that they didn't even know existed. And here we are far ahead. Now they're wanting to make this US Treasury currency play. And my good buddy, Christopher Giancarlo, former CFTC chair, he left the CFTC as chairman and went into a partnership with Accenture and founded probably the leading voice domestically in this central bank digital currency conversation called the Digital Dollar Project. Brilliant guy, attorney, knows what he's doing, and he's got a challenge. But he's proposing not a replacement to the US dollar, but at least a parallel framework and a parallel system where you would still have traditional treasury dollars, cash, right? Traditional bank accounts, but then you have a parallel system that will run to provide the convenience of the programmability and all of the benefits that come with the digital side, the digitization and creating a programmable currency. You're bringing that to bear alongside as a convenience mechanism with the traditional dollar. To date, it has not been contemplated to, hey, let's replace the good old Ben Franklin. let's keep this thing running in parallel. So what are the benefits of central bank digital currencies? Well, a great one is the fact that because it's completely digital, it allows us flexible control over easy design of monetary policies. Of course, that depends on whose hand is on the stick, correct? But then also ease of access to financial services. There are 14 million people in the United States that presently have no bank account and they're completely unbanked, sufficient to the point that they can't even get benefit distribution from our tax dollars that are funding and paying for programs that they would be eligible to receive as a disadvantaged person. Plus, close to real-time payments. You don't have to worry about the settlement, right? You know, the settlement process. You're talking about literally an instantaneous settlement of transaction, just like Bitcoin. And then it creates that programmable money, which is an enterprise programmer and dealing with financial systems and, you know, accounts payable, accounts receivables, and merchant banking, and all of these things that go on across all these industries. The money can be programmed directly into the software instead of you pulling up your QuickBooks account and seeing a number which reflects a number that they got from the bank account and synced. The number that you're looking at is literally the money that's stored inside of the accounting system. It's literally there. So it's a really interesting dynamic of how the technology is changing literally shape with all of the big accounting firms, the consulting firms, EY, PwC, internal controls, internal processing. It's upended everything. The other cool thing is, you know, banks tend to be fairly trustworthy custodians of records, right? They're subject to OCC oversight. And one of the things that happens when a regulator comes in to examine a bank, the first thing they do is, let's look at the records. And depending on the discrepancy, it can be a criminal situation. The chief compliance officer can be held criminally liability at the banking level for having an inaccurate or an incomplete record. So we do know that banks actually do a good job because they'll go to jail if they don't. COVID brought a lot of this about, accelerated our business. We've been in this space working tirelessly for years, slogging through as the market is growing. And then last year, everybody says, we don't want to touch physical money anymore. It's dirty. I can catch a disease from, you know, the paper boys change. So now you're eliminating all of the physical pieces of the puzzle. And so we see a balance between the private sector and then also central bank digital currencies, because the stable coins are very important to the conversation, because the risks of CBDCs are an erosion of the Fourth Amendment and your privacy. The administration is presently contemplating a rule change that will allow them a direct window into any transaction of $600, right? Now, imagine they have a real-time window to the penny. And oh, maybe if your social credit score is not high enough, you get cut off of your actual funds for the next week in a corrective measure. I don't know. I don't know where my mind goes with that. I leave that to the science fiction writers. The other risk, as I alluded to, because it's also a benefit, is, of course, depending on whose hand is on the stick, monetary policy and macroeconomics. What's interesting about this entire situation is the technology has brought together in a nonpartisan way an agreement, and in this fractured era of politics, an unprecedented level of alignment on the benefits and the efficiency side of it. So it brings strange bedfellows. For example, I never thought that I would become, you know, regularly, have regular dialogue with people like Robert Hockett, professor, author of the Green New Deal. He invented the Green New Deal, modern monetary theory, right? I'll argue with him all day long on where to aim the money gun, but we align and we agree that the technology fixes a lot of broken situations across financial markets and capital markets. And then, of course, the last piece of it is cybersecurity. Very important, because now you're dealing with cash in a different way. Cybersecurity is already a very big topic with banks anyway, but it's an even bigger topic when you're now talking about the money itself running on the network. It's a big issue. So what's the political and regulatory landscape look like right now? Well, there's lots of states that are looking at and have already amended their state laws to adopt or allow some form of this emergent form of currency and banking. For example, the state of Wyoming has really led the charge with their Special Purpose Depository Institution Act. They were the first to define at the state level a complete legal definition of digital assets and go through all this and break it down, and then created a new form of state bank charter that's a non-lending bank, depository services, custody services only, that allows the combination of the private currency side, the digital currency and the digital asset, but then still access the Federal Reserve rails. You also have several federal proposals that have been floated. I'm fortunate because I'm in Congressman Davidson's district. And so, he introduced the Token Taxonomy Act in 2018. And I kind of, unofficially take it as a little hat tip because the first time those guys heard the word taxonomy was out of my mouth back in the spring of 18. And then they introduced the bill back in the fall when they were looking, I talked to Congressman Davidson and he's like, well, what do we need to contemplate? And I had my checklist of things, but first of all, you guys want to go pass laws, and we technology guys don't even necessarily agree on the terminology of what these things mean. So we need a common taxonomy that gets injected as law words into the legislation so we can all agree that we're speaking the same language, as opposed to the typical, well, I thought that's what I meant, and then we go to court to argue semantics in front of the judge. So now current proposals that are on the table, you saw last year under the stimuluses, there were some attempts to inject some language into those stimulus bills that created a treasury dollar. The impetus was at that time, how do we rapidly get funds out to people? And of course, what was the exercise with the PPP loans and all that, where the Treasury Department co-opted the banks as customer service departments, and the massive debacle that it was with the SBA and all of the PPP lending that went on, and the fraud that now the FBI is consumed and covered up with, chasing all these PPP loan frauds. It was a mess. And so the idea was at the time, well, maybe we could just have this form of digital currency and put the dollars right into the beneficiary's account wallet. Unfortunately, those things were proposed by the political persuasion that is presently in the administration. And of course, under the Trump era, even though there was some validity from the technology standpoint, that because of the messengers and the folks that were forwarding these proposals, there was a lot of rejection, a lot of resistance. But now we have a new infrastructure bill, right? One of the reasons the infrastructure bill was actually initially delayed was because folks like me organized with the whole industry, the Digital Chamber of Commerce, and a lot of the industry level activists, because there's a broad generalization of certain language that is tantamount to legislating the technology itself, which is a really bad idea. And I could cite you some legal examples of why you don't want to codify technology into the law, because the technology's completely changed a year later. The law never changes, right? So you create these bottlenecks of situations, ultimately downstream court cases challenging some certain things, right? And I can cite specific examples where we've done that even at the federal level, that has created 20 years worth of problem in the capital markets, for example, under SEC regulations and the securities law. They specified a form of technology that doesn't exist anymore. So created this industry where broker dealers have to send all their records off to the service bureau to write this data in a certain way to satisfy and comply with the law. Hopefully we're getting that pulled out eventually. But there's this power struggle that's taking place from federal agency standpoint. The race, who's going to be the first to really regulate and control these things? Will it be Gary Gensler at the SEC? Will it be the OCC and the Treasury Department at the federal level? And then, oh, by the way, you've got the state banking commissioners saying, well, wait a second, what about the 10th Amendment? What about state sovereignty here? Because you can't come in and just issue this big power grab and say all stable coins are now subject to the purview of federal banking charters. That language is in there as well. The other bills that are on the table is the Federal Reserve Act. It's been introduced back in July, and they're basically authorizing the Treasury to create a digital currency and create the actual form of Treasury currency. This is a problem, right? And I'll tell you why. So first of all, let's talk real briefly about banking. The current state of compliance requirements disproportionately hurts community banks from a cost standpoint. Your local savings bank still has the same requirements under federal law or, all of the regulations as big banks, right? There's no break in, well, you're a small bank, therefore you don't have to comply with these things. So there's an awesome opportunity to bring and restore banking back to Main Street by empowering community banks, by empowering these smaller family institutions. I know my local community banker, he signed a couple of my mortgages, third generation banker, right? These are the folks that we want to do business with. I could give a hang less about, HSBC. Oh, sorry, HSBC, didn't mean to say that. But the point being is that I trust an institution where I can walk in the door and sit down with the president of the bank and have a frank conversation with them about something. And in a weird twist of fate, because of the central bank side of the fence and the Fourth Amendment risks and the privacy risks, truth being stranger than fiction, in this macabre mixed up reality, the banker is actually the good guy. They're the last bastion of hope as a private sector solution to maintain our privacy at the currency transaction level as the buffer between the Treasury Department not needing the banks anymore, and now you'll just work with them directly. So real quick, I can tell you what we're doing with 10XTS as part of all of this. We're a software company, a data company. We were founded here in Cincinnati in 2017, part of the startup Cincy community, and hanging out with all the cool kids with the technology development. And we've got this great software platform. And early last year, after Wyoming signed their bill into law, the team got their heads together and said, let's incubate one of these SPDI charter banks. And so I recruited a team, assembled a team, and we worked for a year, put our application in at the end of the year last year. Our application was approved. We had a hearing this past June in Cheyenne, and then August 10th, Commercium Bank was awarded its charter for an SPDI form of actual state chartered bank that then is powered by the software that we build underneath. Completely independent institution. We're the single largest shareholder of the institution, but we're pushing hard on trying to figure out how to inject the technology in the right way, in the right policy vein to bring these things together, because our technology, and I'm not going to go through this, but it's really, really complicated. All of my years working on the GovTech side of the fence, I've got this wild fantasy that guess what? Regulation and examination can also be automated. Think about that. At the government level, I have a banking division with an API that all of the banks under their purview connect to and translate and transmit data with a secure, immutable source of truth that can be trusted mathematically, right? I don't need to worry about the examination issues that the way things work today. So I know that was a lot. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I'm easy to get a hold of. I'll field questions, but michael@10xts.com is my email. I'm also on Twitter at Michael Hiles. And then if you have a smartphone and you really want to get a hold of me and you scan that QR code, then you can actually link to my contact card and download my actual contact information onto your mobile, and you can give me a shout and get a hold of me. So, questions.
Anyone have a question, please raise your hand.
There are no dumb ones either. Yes, ma'am.
Could you compare peer-to-peer with a virtual private network?
It's
Comparison.
a virtual private, that's a great question. A VPN or a virtual private network is a networking method that allows you to mask or tunnel through the public network and give a direct connection kind of below the surface so that that computer is communicating with the other computer directly. So it is very similar in that regard, but from a peer-to-peer network standpoint, it's truly decentralized and completely disconnected. So even the VPN is going to have a centralized server that controls the VPN, whereas this is at the protocol level. It's like HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol, when you type into your www.facebook.com. HTTP represents the protocol that the internet web runs on, right? This is the same way with Bitcoin. Yes, sir.
I had a question. We have all these cyber currencies, mainly the Bitcoin is what I'm going to talk about.
Mhm.
But where does the money go? If I buy a Bitcoin, where does the physical money go?
So there are companies that are in the United States called money services businesses, MSBs. And typically that's a state level charter that you have to obtain in all 50 states. And those cover like the Western Unions and the check cashing folks. So when you connect your bank account, Chase checking account, to a Coinbase account, you would then fund your Coinbase trading account, much like your stock, trading account. And then when you place buy orders or sell orders, whatever the settlement price is of what you're buying Bitcoin for or selling Bitcoin for, those dollars come back to your cash account inside of Coinbase. And then when you want to withdraw that back to the bank, you initiate a withdrawal request. Good question. Any more? I know this is like really mind-numbing, like sci-fi stuff.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about people before that don't have bank accounts.
Mhm.
I probably missed what you were saying, but for people that don't have bank accounts, how do they do business? And what about your homeless?
They all have one of these. They're all sitting outside of the public library using free Wi-Fi in the bushes.
But are they going to understand that kind of transactions?
Well, we've joked around a little bit like, hey, how do you empower folks in the disadvantaged neighborhoods with these cryptocurrencies? And, will your local dealer actually be accepting some stellar coin in exchange for, some, crack rocks or something? It's, sad, but true. And, that's like the stark reality, but they do it with dollars, right? I mean, they do it with actual currency. You'd be surprised. Everybody's got a mobile phone. I mean, Central Africa, people have mobile phones. In fact, a form of currency prior to cryptocurrencies that was already happening in a lot of Central African nations is mobile phone credits, the M-Pesa, right? I'm going to buy some fruit from you. I don't have any currency that's of any substance. Well, I've got, 3,000 extra mobile phone credits I can send you. And mobile phone credits for prepaid mobile phone cellular is a transactional form of currency in those nations. Amazing, isn't it? Yes, sir.
I think I like the dollar.
Comment. Okay. Technical people have a tendency to keep the same definition that you mentioned about various words and what do they mean. Politicians and government officials seem to twist them no matter how. And then I have a question about when the internet, the system goes down for whatever reason, political, natural causes or whatever, how do people keep cash on hand that they're advised to do for such situations?
And that is a great question. The great thing about a decentralized network is it's not reliant on any centralization. Therefore, as long it operates kind of like the internet in a way that if you take out part of the network, the whole network doesn't go down. And it even does that down to the single server level. And there are hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin servers running globally in many jurisdictions. So as long as there's at least one Bitcoin server node up and operating, then the ledger and all of the data set is retained. So the likelihood of a global scale outage is great because of the lack of decentralization. However, there is no actual decentralization with a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, because it's once again centralized at the Federal Reserve level and has to phone home on their network. It's not a participatory network where people can just download the software on a machine, a computer that they have at home and plug it in and start working as a Bitcoin node, right? You can do that. Anyone can. It's completely democratized. There's no rules. You download the server software and plug it in and run it. just like the slide that I showed that had that spider mess of all those cables and, that tangled mess. It's participatory, allows anybody who has the hardware and a network connection somewhere to plug in. The coins never leave the network. So even if the lights go out for certain nodes, they're still there. And in fact, the private key, a lot of people have their Bitcoins, in a wallet on the network. They never leave, the coins never leave the network. But what they do is they'll take their private key and they'll engrave it like on dog tags or something. And so if I want to take my money with me, I can walk across the border and access a Bitcoin server or a Bitcoin ATM or service in the new jurisdiction using my private key, because Bitcoin doesn't recognize jurisdictions. Bitcoin doesn't care. That's why there's a lot of frustration between this Bitcoin thing, and they know that they can't put the genie back into the bottle with Bitcoin at this point, but they certainly can control the rails converting Bitcoin to cash, cash to Bitcoin, and that's what you've seen from a regulatory standpoint.
I have one more question. What would you recommend as far as, Bitcoin being the most known, but there's got to be hundreds of these things out there in other
Thousands.
countries. What ones would you recommend?
You're asking me for investment advice.
Well, not really investment advice, but
You want to know what's in my portfolio
are
right
they
now?
really stable? How stable, Bitcoin seems like it's like the number one,
It's the largest, most capitalized network. Yeah.
but I mean, as far as being hacked or, these other, it's like company stocks, some companies are looser than others. Is there a standard for that or not?
No, there are no standards. The math is the standard. The math that operates the cryptography, that operates the network, that's the standard that everybody agrees to when participating in the network. Outside of that, all rules are off. We're redefining even how the digital assets that's not backed like a stable coin with a real world dollar asset, because there's also tokenization of real estate that's taking place right now. We specifically operate in the security space. So we're taking the same technology and applying it to making programmable forms of actual securities, stocks, debt, et cetera, and connecting those with an entirely emergent new capital markets ecosystem with broker dealers, trading exchanges that are licensed in the security space, not the cryptocurrency guys like Binance or Coinbase. That's just digital asset, non-security, intangible property, right? But we're applying that technology to actually making a more efficient secondary market for capital markets, which is part of the bank and some of those things. But, to your point, what's the value of any of these things? What's the value of the US dollar? What is the value of the dollar? I believe that there will be something to tax in 100 years when we're still paying off the current debt, right? I mean, it's the belief of the future output of society.
As far as regulation, other countries regulation.
Yep.
Other countries regulating, different rules like you were talking about.
Mhm.
How they tax it. I mean, how do you find out, when you're looking to invest in something like that?
Tax is an interesting issue with this because you're still subject to capital gains, and there's a lot of rule changes around 1031 swaps were a loophole that, people were trading Bitcoin for another type of cryptocurrency at a gain and leveraging the 1031 swaps. And back in 2018, they closed that loophole real fast. But when it comes to the taxation of your gains on your just purely cryptocurrency trading, you're still subject to, short-term ordinary income or, long-term capital gains, just like any other gain that you would make from any other investment. If you buy low, sell high. There's an argument that are these things more like collector items like Beanie Babies or, Pokemon cards or something. As long as there's a profit that's associated, then, the IRS is going to come and ask for the handout, which is interesting because you see tax-friendly jurisdictions like Puerto Rico, for example. Puerto Rico is the Silicon Valley of blockchain and cryptocurrency because of Act 60. It's a gift. There's literally no capital gains on any of it, no short-term capital gains on trading. So all the traders go to San Juan and you have like $500 billion in new capital that's migrated to Puerto Rico in the past 3 years since Act 60 was passed. There's zero capital gains. And you can be a US citizen, permanent resident, spend 6 months on the island, come back home, as long as you're 184 days here. It's, it's an amazing situation. Once again, Puerto Rico has just recently, for the first time ever, domestically approved statehood. And so they think that they're going to get rid of their liability for all of their defaults on their Puerto Rican bonds by exchanging that with the pre-existing liability of becoming a US state. I try to advise them of that. We've been down 6 times this year to Puerto Rico. And we talked to the folks down there. It's like, I don't know that I would trade those terrible bond situations that you have for the terrible tax liability situation that you would have if, God forbid, we would convene a convention of the states and add you to the 51st. So we'd love to have you, but. So I thought there were some questions over here. Yes, ma'am.
My question was a tax question as well. So I guess you have to pay taxes on your cryptocurrency?
Absolutely.
Well, how do they know what's your,
The exchanges report.
oh.
Yeah,
the-
in fact, last year, like Coinbase or Binance, where you're buying and selling on those exchanges. So,
They give the report.
yeah,
to
the IRS actually subpoenaed about 10,000, I think it was 10,000 Coinbase accounts last year. It was only people who had more than $10,000 in assets in their accounts, but they subpoenaed the list of the data because they were going to examine. The IRS is staffed up in a big way for enforcement and compliance as of late. There are a whole lot of subpoenas being prepared across the board for lots of this kind of stuff. Of course, we're regulatory compliance folks. We're governance risk compliance software, and like it's great for us. So, yes, sir.
Yes, you talk a lot. You said a lot about cryptology, okay? And what is going to prevent hackers from getting into individuals, people's accounts? And how is it possible to get that money back if they happen to do that? I mean,
Great.
I haven't, no matter, a lot of companies keep getting hacked, okay? They keep getting held up for ransom. What makes this any different?
Great question. The blockchains themselves, the networks themselves have never been hacked. It's the connection points, like the exchanges, like the custodians. They're the ones that have been breached that then results in cryptocurrencies being taken. Unfortunately, depending on the cryptocurrency, particularly in Bitcoin, if they steal the Bitcoin, it's gone. So the institution better have some insurance basically at that point. So cryptography is an interesting question because anything that can be encrypted can also be decrypted, right? There are new forms of computing. Typically what's kept the bad guys at bay in the cybersecurity world is we have cryptography that's so complex that with current processors, if I'm trying to brute force and just, try to keep trying the same, different passwords over and over and over in rapid fire sequence would take, 20,000 years to hack a single account. Now there's new forms of computing online. Fortunately, I'm at the end of my career and I don't have to relearn any processing. It's all still ones and zeros for me, but there's this fancy new form of computing processing called quantum computing, right? And instead of ones and zeros, it takes on quantum physics that allows exponentially more processes to take place in the same time period, blazing fast, light, like human brain fast. Well, if now I'm compressing the time that it took 20,000 years to brute force hack an account with traditional forms of processing down to say 45 minutes, that's a problem. Fortunately, people a lot smarter than me, like at the national, like NIST, for example, they've been exploring and they've awarded grants over the past several years for emergent new forms of math. There's actually new forms of mathematical cryptography that's being developed that's quantum proof. So it's always a race between the bad guys and the good guys to try to stay ahead. And it will continue to be that way. But it is, once again, on the risk side, as you saw at the very bottom, cybersecurity. And of course, from a compliance standpoint, and what are we even looking for? These are all new emergent forms of technology. The technology guys typically are pretty good at knowing how to shut the door, right? In the instances where there have been major breaches, inside jobs, brute force hacks that take place, usually a flaw in the code, something like that. Just raw attack of the network is typically not taking place at this point in the crypto sphere. So hopefully, knock on wood, that the math will still continue to stay complex enough to keep the bad guys out for a period of time.
We have a few online questions.
Yeah.
The first person is wondering if you can tell us anything about the Cincinnati Crypto Fund. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, so I'm a general partner in the Cincinnati Crypto Fund. What we did is we put together, it's a 506 fund, so it's for accredited investors only. But it allows people who are interested in being exposed to the investment opportunity and the volatility without actually having to get their hands on the technology. It's a traditional limited partnership. And then we work with various other funds and active trading desks in the space. We have relationships with them to produce a return. So if you go to Cincy, C-I-N-C-Y, crypto, CRYPTO.fund, you can see the fund website there and contact us, and we'll have one of the general partners reach out to you.
Alrighty, thank you. Now, you've already touched on this a little bit, but the next person is wondering really just how vulnerable is digital currency, not only to hacking, but also an attack on the power grid.
Well, that's a great question. And of course, the decentralization of the network is paramount because it would be difficult to attack an entire, global power grid. That's what you're basically talking about. And so, there is weak points in the chain, but to the extent that there is projects that are exploring forms of, localized sustainable energy, you find a lot of Bitcoin mining operations, these network center operations are actually operating right at the source of power generation. So for example, in Iceland, there's some geyser, some thermo heat driven power generation where they have mining operations literally at the source of generation. You see a lot of hydroelectric, for example, examples. So it is forcing a rethinking in a lot of ways also around the power conversation, because that's a lot of criticism is, wow, we're spending all of this money with electric costs supporting these networks. It's a big criticism, right? Is this actually green?
Right.
Fortunately, there are other forms of consensus that don't require the same level of power consumption that Bitcoin does. So it's really Bitcoin and its form of consensus that consumes and eats up all the juice. That was first generation. We've advanced since then. So it's a lot like, AOL versus Facebook at this point, in that sphere.
Here's an interesting question. If China gets their digital currency going before others, will their digital currency possibly become the base currency, or I guess they mean reserve currency, much like the US dollar is today? And wouldn't that devalue our dollar?
The short answer is yes. I mean, the bottom line is that the first person who can offer a central bank-backed digital currency, the first nation that can do that provides payment settlement with the faith and backing of a central bank attached to it, is going to really accelerate the adoption in a lot of smaller nations that may already be looking to decouple from the Federal Reserve dollar anyway, as we've recently seen with the experiment in El Salvador that passed a law that made Bitcoin an actual legal form of tender in El Salvador.
We have a person wondering about some more possible downsides of cryptocurrency. They've heard that when a country changes currency, it often causes a loss in value of people's assets, in other words, people's money. And secondly, what about the risk of governments using this digital control to manipulate or redistribute wealth?
Well, once again, the pros of the monetary policy versus the cons of the monetary policy are determined by whose hands on the stick. So yes, it is absolutely a risk, because when we change monetary policy right now, it typically takes 10, 15, 20, 30 years, which are incidentally also pegged to how long we borrow money as a treasury, because it takes that long for the policy to ripple all the way through the cycle traditionally now. Now we're talking about flipping a switch and changing monetary policy overnight. And we may find that if all of a sudden we now are only operating with purely treasury currency, central bank digital currencies, we wake up one morning and we find like a zero lopped off of the end of our bank account because they rebased or something bad like that.
So is China's digital dollar called the yuan?
Yeah, the yuan.
I thought that I had read where they were going to release that during the Olympics. Have you heard that?
It was released. That was one of the experiments that they ran.
I thought they were talking about the one coming up. So
No, they ran it the last big soiree that they had. They were already experimenting in China. China's years ahead of us. They've been working on this for years now. So their policy is already in place for wide scale distribution for the yuan across multiple jurisdictions, because their goal is to be the cheapest form of settlement currency possible, right? So you'll go to the gas pump and see, I mean, right now you can use, certain payment settlement services that are Chinese based at certain gas pumps right here in the United States, right? It's already accepted as part of the nomenclature. So, we have WorldPay FIS here locally, right? They do payment processing, credit card processing systems. And this is also having an impact on their business, right? It's creeping up on all of the credit card payment processing. You look at who's acquiring who, Visa, MasterCard, they're all acquiring blockchain related companies at this point because they know where it's going. China's ahead.
So what was the real success of what they released during the Olympics, and what's the US doing about that?
We're still planning to plan.
But was there any real success? I mean, I don't know.
They are settling transactions with an yuan in, experimental pilot environments across borders, not just in China, but literally cross-border transactions. Those are occurring today.
We got time for one more question. Does anybody have anything?
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, you talk about China and the yuan, they just delegitimized Bitcoin. Does that have anything to do with their implementation of the yuan?
Yes, obviously Bitcoin is an existential threat to any central bank digital currency, but I also joke around, this is the fifth time that China has banned Bitcoin. So we joke and laugh and say, well, Xi Jinping must have wanted to, drop the price and buy the dip and load back up on some more Bitcoin and ride the market back up. So no. If a Chinese citizen has Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet on the Bitcoin network, they can cross a border and still access that Bitcoin from anywhere in the world. Good stuff.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you, buddy.
When did you say Bitcoin was about 10 years ago when it came out?
The white paper came out in 2008 and 2009, the network launched.
Okay. I know it had to be at least 10 years ago. When I heard about it, I went to listen to someone talk about it. And I can tell you they weren't as good as you were. But I also took that information and shelved it in the back of my mind because I thought, no, I don't like this.
My first Bitcoin transaction, I was standing outside my office up in Columbus, and I downloaded a wallet onto my mobile phone, and I bought Bitcoin for $15. And when it hit $140, I was like, woohoo! Sold it all. That's why I'm still working for a living. So, so you don't want investment advice from me.
Well, at that time it was over my head, and I'm going to say it's still a little bit over my head. And you and everybody else needs to make sure that we keep that two-tier system going.
I agree. Now, what I can tell you is on the pure cryptocurrency side of the fence, those guys are like literally anarcho-capitalists at heart. They are extreme libertarians. So their distrust of the government, their distrust of the banking system is what, has fueled that involvement. So it's an interesting political mix-up when it comes to policy, because you've got all of these hardcore Austrian economics lovers and, designing currencies with, Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million of them. It is a deflationary system. You cannot mint anymore. The math will not permit it. Once again, an existential threat to treasury currencies.
Well, one of my big concerns is, they tell us the number one thing we should be concerned about is our grids being attacked. So if, God forbid, that our grids would ever go down, none of us are not going to know how to survive, but we better have something that's not technology.
I agree. I live up in Preble County, so, chickens and pigs and
So you're already living off the grid? Is that what
I'm
you're
not,
saying?
I'm not Tom Massey. I'm not living completely off the grid, but I've got family that live on literally the state line border between Ohio and Indiana. And it's pretty far out. So that'll be the last place they get to around here. So
Well, Michael, thank you
Thank you
again.
so
It was
much.
very good.
thanks, everybody.
Joanne C. at Yahoo was our online winner of the book Woke Inc. So Joanne, we will be getting that out to you. And Dan will be back with us next week. And Dan, if you're online, Michael said when he came in, everybody he talks to, he knows you, but he doesn't know you now. So, so you've been missed since you've been gone. We're looking forward to having him back next week. And just as a reminder, again, the class on Tuesday starts at 6:30 and it will not be posted to the website later. Thank you for coming and have a safe trip home.